broader military context. We're going to shift to a specific battle action and tremendous initiative on the part of the 6th Army Group, and then we're going to give the biographer a chance. The biographer who's with us. One of the ironies is that we went for a long time with no biographies, and now we've got 2 in rapid succession. Many of you were here last night with Scott Wheeler. He promises he's not going to give exactly the same address today that he gave last night. And since we're only giving him half an hour, I think we're safe. Before we start, though, I did want to say 2 things about where we are in all this. If you get the Journal of the York County Heritage Society, I highly recommend Daniel Rowe's essay on the archive holdings here. I also thank Dan for all he's done, and Lila all she's done, not only on this great symposium that they've put together, but in the great preservation of this heritage that's been a part of this trust. This is a fine historical society journal, and I commend it to you. I've also been told by the president of this fine society, authors are always welcome. So if you've got a topic in mind, get it into the editor. The other thing I wanted to tell you is that many in York and General Devers himself were disappointed in that Tom Grease, who was for many years the head of the history department at West Point, did not complete the biography. But Tom Grease was an interesting guy. He arrived at West Point the same year that Devers left to go off and be chief of staff down in Panama. And he became a career officer. His class was graduated early in January rather than June of '43. He became an engineer, served in the Southwest Pacific, liberation of the Philippines and the Okinawa campaign. And he was a construction engineer, so when the war was over, he stayed in the Far East for 2 more years on the reconstruction in Okinawa, which was largely what became the Air and Marine Corps bases, and one-time Army bases that were in Okinawa, some still there, with some controversy. And then back down to the Philippines, where he was involved in the upgrade of Clark Air Force Base, which is the old Fort Stosselberg. So then he went on to a very successful military career, got a master's degree in civil engineering, went to the Commander General Staff College, taught engineering and military art at West Point, went back to SHAPE this time as a construction engineer when we were still rebuilding and building in Europe, back in the early 60s when SHAPE headquarters was still in France. And then became a tenured professor at West Point. And it's about at that time, after he's finished his dissertation, that he approached General Devers and asked for the opportunity to be his biographer. And he didn't succeed in writing. There's lots of good reasons. One, he formed the history department at West Point from very disparate elements. Up until that time, military art, what we think of as military history, was taught by graduates of Commander General Staff College. Modern history was taught by people who had gone to graduate school, many of whom were junior reserve officers. And so the 2 elements did not meld easily, especially since this was at the height of the Vietnam War. And many of those young reservists were viewed by the career officers who had been teaching military art as draft dodgers who'd been hanging out at graduate school. Tom Grease worked his way through that and lots of other things. But I did want you to know that in doing his research, he compiled tremendous sets of oral histories and documents from other archives. And they're here for our researchers. And so when you see those as a supplement to the wonderful Devers archive, you get a sense of a peculiar and unique strength of this archive for a broad range of subjects in military history. And it's not well known. So I just wanted to make sure many of you are interested in subjects of military history, and you can go well beyond Devers' career with the archive right here in York. So I just want you to know that. But now let's shift back to York, because we're going to do this in sort of in a life history order, and Rich Robinson, whose biography is in your brochure, is going to start us out with a discussion of the York connection.
Thank you, General Nelson. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
While I get situated, I'll give you a few other details. I'm going to give you the civilian perspective on General Devers' life, and I think this is perfectly fitting because, as one of my colleagues pointed out when he looked at the brochure materials, from a military standpoint, I'm the least qualified member of this panel. I was kicked out of the Civil Air Patrol. So, the closest ever I came to military discipline was being a member of a bagpipe band in New York City. Jacob Devers, the early years. I have to turn on the mic. Am I loud enough? Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay. See how this works? How's that? Yeah. Okay, I can tone it down a little bit, right? Okay. Okay. This is Metro York in the 1880s. This is the York that General Devers would have known slightly. It was certainly the York of his father and his grandfather. But by the time he left for West Point in 1905, most of the scene had changed because of the explosive growth taking place in this community. The sheds in the foreground, the market sheds, came down. The old courthouse in the background, that came down. And most of the buildings lining along Market Street all came down within Devers' early years here in York. Now, a lot of times in biographies, especially in the old days, people would write about momentous events that took place when a famous person was born. A comet would cross the sky. Of course, we know the most famous episode is the Star of Bethlehem, with the birth of Jesus of Nazareth. Here's an inkling of what happened on September 8th in and around York when Jacob Devers was born. Mr. Felix Bensel reported that persons or persons unknown raided his spring house of butter and sausages, besides upsetting things generally. An Alderney cow belonging to State Senator Gerard Brown returned home after missing for several days, missing part of its tail. Foul play was suspected until the culprit was identified as a briar bush. And on West York Avenue, a boy was born to Philip and Ella Kate Devers. As we can see, the heavens were not giving us any signs when Jacob Devers was born. Now, the other thing that I think is characteristic of biographies is that you get the impression that great men are born, they spring from their mother's womb full grown, beating their chest. This is Jake Devers at 3 years old, dramatic proof that he came into the world in an unusual and normal way. But one of the things I want to touch on in his time in Europe, actually it touches on a story later of Jake Devers, because a lot of people who were his enemies kind of dismissed him as not very bright, not very smart. General Eisenhower characterized him as 22 caliber. Mark Clark called him a dope. And even George Patton said he wasn't meant to go very far. So what I want to talk about today is to try to get a sense of who Jake Devers was as a young man and what he learned here in Europe, to see if that had any bearing on his character later in life. Because if the child is truly father of the man, much of what he became later was influenced by his years here. And I think the answer to that is yes, York did have a very strong influence on him in a very positive way. And I think part of that influence came from his family. His grandfather, James Devers, was a blacksmith here in town, and by the look of this photograph, a fairly prosperous one. He was a very well-to-do man in his day. Shoed 20 mules in a day, according to Jake Devers as a young man, and he had very vivid memories of his grandfather taking him to Sunday school every Sunday, because James Devers was truly a devout and God-fearing man and instilled this value in his grandson. And his father had a tremendous influence in his life, too. Philip Devers went to work as a jewelry store clerk right out of high school and worked at Sievers and Devers on George Street his whole life. One of his attributes was that he could speak Pennsylvania Dutch very well and attracted numerous customers from in and around York who would come to Sievers and Devers particularly because they could converse with Philip Devers when they couldn't converse with other jewelers in town. I think this is going to have a bearing on our story as well. Philip Devers was also noted for being a very personal man and understanding of other people and other people's feelings. And that quality, according to many of Jacob Devers' boyhood friends, was translated to his son, was communicated to his son in a very strong and positive way. Just for local colors, for those of us who live in New York, that's the Sievers Endeavor store on George Street. The building is still there. If you take a walk down the block, you'll see it. And we have his mother, Ella Kate, who was the daughter of a prosperous gentleman farmer, Jacob Laux. Ella was said to be a person of nervous disposition. She had headaches frequently, and they had to engage the services of a hired girl. There's an indication of her temperament when Jacob Devers was promoted to Brigadier General. She was interviewed by a local reporter, and her response was, "I just don't understand, this is all, it's all beyond me." And that was the end of her pronouncements on her son's promotion. Now, in 1886, when Philip and Ella Kate got married, they moved to the west end of town, a neighborhood that was upcoming called the Avenues, which I think is about 3/4 of a mile from where we're sitting. But this was the up-and-coming, really the first streetcar suburb of York, I think, with Victorian mansions, a country club, where you could engage in the finer points of outdoor lawn tennis, golf, and croquet. But Jake Devers was not part of this crowd. He and his family were not part of it. His house is on West York Avenue. If you go out West York Avenue, you can see a marker outside of that. They were actually in a much different environment, in a much different world, I think. Even though they lived on the right side of the tracks, they could still see the industrial development that was taking place in York. Their home was closer to this environment in this neighborhood. Jake Devers, as an older man, said later in life, "I really hung around with kids who were the tough sons of tough men, who had hard jobs, foundry men, machinists, and men who worked with their hands." So in that sense, he came up, I don't want to say he came up the hard way, because I don't mean that, but he learned how to interact with a tough group of kids. His Park Street gang was really, they were a tough bunch of boys. And Jacob Devers was able to really be accepted by this group. And when you think about it, you can see these guys standing around saying, "What's your dad do?" "Well, he's a foundryman," or "He's a steam fitter." "What's your dad do, Jake?" "He's a jewelry store clerk." A little bit of a disparity there. St. Paul's Church, where he went to church, that's the site of the Pleasant Police Headquarters. Very important influence, according to General Devers, because there was no library system in York at that time. St. Paul's had a library in their Sunday school, and he read those books voraciously, particularly the Henty books. And I wasn't aware of what the Henty books were, and I had to look them up. There were a series of books by an Englishman named George Alfred Henty, which basically were Horatio Alger stories set in the British Empire. And Jake went through those every Sunday, and also read the standard American versions of Horatio Alger and Frank Merriwell. The county courthouse, this is the third county courthouse, had an influence on his life because his father was appointed county clock keeper. Now the county clock keeper had to go up ladders into the tower in the courthouse and adjust water levels and battery acid. And for a number of years, Philip Devers had Jacob do it because he was smaller and lighter and could shimmy up the ladders a lot more easily. Jacob Devers learned to hate science of horology and never wanted to see that clock that much again after he engaged in that corrective process. His grammar school, he remembered that vividly because he was once beaten with a switch and decided that he was never going to suffer corporal punishment again, and he never did. Now these are the Devers boys when Jake was around 10. That's his brother Philip in the middle and Frank on the end. Now, the funny part there, I think, is Jake looks like he's considerably older, and they were only a year apart. Now, about this time, something else would happen that I think had a tremendous influence on his later life. The Spanish-American War, explosion of the USS Maine. Now, in military history, we might think of the Spanish-American War as something of a barroom fight in broad daylight. It was over before it started. But I think it had a tremendous influence on the future career of General Devers, simply because when the war broke out, the Navy sailed them into Manila Bay, shot the Spanish fleet to pieces, did the same thing off of Cuba, off of Santiago, shot the Spanish fleet to pieces. The Army was finding it was having a tremendous problem transporting a sizable body of men to an island that was less than 100 miles off the coast of Florida. And two of the men who appreciated this more than many others were Elihu Root, Secretary of War for President McKinley, and Colonel and later President Theodore Roosevelt. And Root was instrumental in starting to get the Army changing from its past orientation of fighting Indians and acting as a frontier constabulary to really preparing itself for a global mission. And I think he realized that one of the problems American officers were going to be facing in the future was how to handle ramping up a sizable military force quickly, equipping it, supplying it, and squaring off the needs of military discipline with the democratic ideals of the citizen soldier. And this would, I think, have a tremendous bearing on General Devers' later career. Now, he started high school inauspiciously. Because the first day he entered high school with a bunch of his friends from Garfield School, they were summarily thrown out before the first period and went over to the Soldiers and Sailors Monument to talk things over. And they all agreed that they couldn't go home and show their faces and tell their parents that they'd been kicked out of high school before the end of the first period. So what did they do? They appointed Jacob Devers to be their spokesman to beg Professor McLaury to let them back in. And Professor McLaury relented and did let them back in. But later may have regretted it because this group was strongly suspected of releasing a flock of pigeons in the auditorium during a school exercise. Incidentally, Philip Devers raised pigeons on West York Avenue. I made no inferences there. Now this is Jake at the age of 16 when he's starting to think about going to West Point. But he was really afraid of one thing and one thing particularly, and this was a lasting influence throughout his life. He didn't think he spoke very well. He didn't think he was very articulate. And this is ironic because he was elected president of the Debating Society. But throughout his life, he always doubted his ability to communicate well. And I think really strongly this had a tremendous influence on his relationships with those people who didn't like him very much, to wit General Eisenhower and General Bradley. He was so fearful, and his father was so fearful that he would not do well on the West Point entrance exams if he had to take them, that his father enlisted the aid of a high school English teacher who had been recruited from New England to help him with his English. And when you read some of General Devers' commentary, he's almost referring to English as a second language. I just want to quote, and this is a quote from his later years, when he said, "It always bothered me, it does to this day, that I have a very defeatist complex with reference to English. I advise everybody to concentrate on that." What I find really ironic about that is I think Jacob Devers was a man of supreme self-confidence. But for him to admit this weakness says to me that here's a guy who really knew himself pretty well, and he knew himself well at a younger age. Now, as he's preparing or thinking about going to West Point, there's a real problem brewing. And it concerns our local congressman, Dan Lafine. Dan Lafine was a Republican who was elected to Congress after making a fortune in the candy business. And he had a pretty good reputation except for one thing. All of his West Point appointments had washed out or been found. They didn't make it. And he was fit to be tied because apparently he was taking a lot of flack from his colleagues in Congress about his lack of ability to appoint a young man from his district who could actually finish at West Point. He thought he had a great candidate in a young man named David Long here in York. But David Long's parents were, his father was a minister. And his father told his son he didn't raise his boy to be a soldier and he didn't want him to accept the appointment. And David Long refused the appointment. Now apparently Dan Lafine went ballistic. And he said to one of his aides, a man named Sam Lewis, from the Parker's name, "By God, I'd appoint the devil himself to take this appointment." Now Sam Lewis's brother lived close to the Devers, and he was a Mason, just as Philip Devers was. And Sam Lewis said, "Well, Congressman, I might be able to do just as well. Instead of the devil, how about the son of a registered Democrat?" And Dan Lafine Jake got the appointment. He graduated in 1905, and if you've read the prophecy of the York High, they foresaw him becoming the general of the army, fighting a climactic battle with the Russians. And while he was fighting that final battle, he was hit with an improbable shoulder wound and nursed to health by that young lady right there, Louise Evans, who received a marriage proposal for her trouble. Now, this is one thing that I'm always curious about. I mean, when prophecies like this are made up, there's always got to be some basis that, you know, were Devers and Louise an item? I don't know. And I know that for a fact she never married. At their 30th reunion, she was living in New York City, still as Louise Evans. So maybe she never got over that climactic battle in nursing Jacob Devers to health. We'll never know. Now, in 1905, of course, he went to West Point. There is his mother in the summer. I think this is one of the 3 times Ella Kate Devers ever left York. She was a real homebody. And here we have Portrait of a General as a Young Man. Now, in closing, I would just like to say, I believe strongly that General Devers was highly influenced by his time here in New York. And the reason I say that is, not being a native Yorker, I've come to appreciate a quality among Yorkers in their sense of decency and their sense of generosity. And I think Jacob Devers embodied those qualities, and he brought them home to his heart. And he always thought that way about his hometown, and he remembered it fondly. Which leads me to one question that I know where I stand on it. I believe strongly Jacob Devers was an outstanding general, better than a lot of guys that have more exalted reputations. Was he a better general because he was a better man? I think he was. Thank you very much for listening.
Rich has a few more minutes on our clock, and while he totally has your attention, I'd be glad to let him entertain a few questions before we introduce the next speaker. Does anyone have questions? Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
What happened to his brothers?
His brother Frank went out to work for, well, he started out with the York Ice Company and wound up in California. His brother Philip went to work for General Electric and actually had several patents. One of them, I think, concerned ultraviolet light. He lived in Massachusetts. They both predeceased Jake Devers, but his daughter Nancy actually married a career Army officer, and they're living in Easton, Maryland now. I had the good fortune to visit them one time and talk to them about their boyhood, and Nancy always thought it was hysterical that Jake's Irish ancestry was played up during the opening months of the war. And she said, you know, our household is basically German. But yeah, I didn't play well in those days, I guess. So they really upped the Irish connection. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
I don't know where I read it. I read it where his grandfather used to walk into church and Sunday school and so forth, a Lutheran, I believe. But in the same reading, it said Jacob was not a very religious person. Is that a true statement, you think?
Yes and no. After he left home, his religion became polo. And on Sunday, you wouldn't find him in church, you'd find him out in the polo field. And, you know, personally, I don't think it's any accident that he became a polo player. Because as Scott Wheeler said last night, it was a team sport. He was very much a team sport guy. But did he lose his faith in God? Never. He remained a devout man all his life. Never joined another church. One thing I failed to mention about the team sport angle, he realized very early in his life that he was not the best, the most agile, able athlete. But what he did was observe those guys who were. He was of the Yogi Berra school. You can observe a lot just by watching. And he did. And he would go and talk to the guys that were the best on the field, the best at what they did. And I think this characterized his conduct as an officer as well. He believed very strongly in not compiling reams of memos and letters and all that. If you could just walk down the hall and talk to a guy about a basic problem. He was a firm believer in that as a way for quick action. And it developed an ability to analyze problems very quickly and very simply. He was a firm advocate, I believe, of the principle, keep it simple.
Please, go ahead.
Is there any relatives of General Devers still in New York?
Not to my knowledge. Well, I shouldn't say that. Not with the last name Devers. But I think basically, New York being New York, you can't throw a stone without hitting somebody who's second or third cousin. My wife works with a guy at the York County Courthouse who's a sixth cousin twice removed. I'm very quick to inform you of that. So there are a lot of collateral relatives. He was related to the Gladfelter family too. So he has quite a few collateral relatives among the Gladfelters.
Didn't he ride in a victory parade out Roosevelt Avenue after the war?
Yes, he did. He did. And he stopped at his boyhood home, and I believe he was presented with a cane that had significance because it belonged to his father or his grandfather, I believe. And always had warm feelings for York. He attended a Rotary presentation, a Rotary luncheon, I think in 1976, which was only a few years before he died.
Is there a historical marker at his home?
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. It's right outside. It's one in our town. I personally believe he deserves many, many more. And I think our next tank should be named after Jacob Devers. I really do. I can say it to you because I hope I'm among friends.
It's time now to move on to Dr. Conrad Crane.
My talk is really going to be on why Jacob Devers has been a forgotten or at least underappreciated general. He reminds me a lot of, I'm from northeastern Pennsylvania, and our forgotten general is a guy named John Yosak, who was commander of the 3rd Army in Desert Storm. Everybody knows about Norman Schwarzkopf, who was a great self-promoter, but nobody knows about John Yosak, who did all his fighting for him. So that happens to Pennsylvanians a lot for some reason. I also want to focus on a forgotten part of his career, which is his period as command of the European Theater of Operations in 1943 that helped set the stage for those that are to come after me. I want to open with a couple of short film clips. When I taught at West Point in the 1990s, I had the privilege, I taught a generalship course, and I had a privilege to get together 3 great military historians, Stephen Ambrose, a biographer of Dwight Eisenhower, and of course the Band of Brothers, Martin Blumenson, the Pat biographer, and Brooks Kleber, who was one of the authors of the Green Book series on World War II. And in front of the cadets, I gave them the question to talk about which generals are underrated, which generals are overrated. And I want to show this film clip. There's a couple clips here from Martin Blumenson. Most of the session ended up basically as Stephen Ambrose trying to defend Eisenhower and Bradley against assaults from Blumenson. But I want to talk a couple of clips of Blumenson where he talks about what makes a great general. And listen to what he says, and I'll continue once we've heard the 2 clips. Thank you.
How do you judge whether a general officer is underrated or overrated? How do you judge whether he's good or bad? And it seems to me that the first, can you hear me okay? Is it all right? The first people who render judgment on the performance of a general officer in wartime is the press, the media, the public relations people. And they decide who the hotshots are and who the good ones are and who the not so good ones are. And it takes a lot more, it seems to me, than success to be chosen by the media to be one of the heroes in combat. For example, all the reporters, all the war correspondents accredited to General Patton's headquarters, whenever he announced a meeting with them, They all attended, and so did everybody else who could get there from the other armies. Because Patton was entertainment. Patton was blasphemous. He said outrageous things. He made jokes. Everybody loved to come and hear him. And I think in large part this is why Patton became a hero. He got the publicity. For example, William Simpson, who was probably just as good an army commander as George Patton was, we hear very little about today. But that's because the newspaper people were not terribly interested in Simpson. So I think that the newspaper or the publicity, the public relations people decided first, and then the historians come along and they judge a performance by the success that it has generated. And generally, I think the historians follow the public relations people. So that it's hard to say whether people are overrated or underrated 50 years after the event today, because the people have taken their places in our pantheon of heroes, and there they stand, and it's really there's not much we can do about changing their reputations.
Everybody can understand his point. Okay, he'll re-emphasize again in the second clip.
In conclusion, I strongly suspect that the reputations established during wartime generally hold up over the succeeding years. There were few surprises in later years. The news media, by publicizing or withholding information, originally determined a general officer's worth, and historians later on substantiate or modify those points of view. All we can do now, except for the very few rare exceptions, is to substantiate again what we have known for a long time. Thank you.
Okay, and the discussion went more down that road as well. In contrast, I learned a lot actually from the first presentation that reinforces the point when talked about Jacob Devers' reticence in speaking. Devers is not a self-promoter, he's not flamboyant, he doesn't attract the press people to his press briefings. And there's nobody looking out for him. You know, in contrast, Omar Bradley becomes a hero because General Eisenhower in the Mediterranean grabs Ernie Pyle, who is the quintessential reporter, combat reporter of the era, and he orders him, go make Omar Bradley a hero. And Pyle goes out and creates a whole bunch of these articles about Omar Bradley, the soldier's general, which is completely fabricated. And that becomes the image of Omar Bradley. And Omar Bradley was very, very careful to cultivate that image. He and his wife as well. I mean, how many people have seen the movie Patton? Sure. You know who the technical advisor is for the movie Patton? It's Omar Bradley. You know who wrote the script for the movie Patton? Omar Bradley's wife. The movie should have been called Bradley. And if you really watch it, I mean, Carl Malden, the old friendly Carl Malden, I mean, but this is all part of the Bradley image. We have Bradley's papers at the Military History Institute, and we have records where Mrs. Bradley came in to destroy papers because she thought they were not complimentary enough for her husband. There's a very careful attempt to cultivate image with Bradley. It's painfully obvious when you go through, again, I was actually the trustee for the Omar Bradley estate when Mrs. Bradley died, got a chance to go through a lot of that stuff. And then it's amazing how careful he was to cultivate his image through his whole career. But when you actually go through the record, he was one of the more ruthless commanders we've had. He fired people right and left. He was very hard to work for. But again, you have this image of this kind of homey guy with glasses who never kind of bothered anybody and did all these, just kind of did all the right things without publicizing himself, when it was really the exact opposite in many ways. Again, Devers was not flashy or a self-promoter, and again, if you're reticent, if you're not willing to go out and speak to the press, you're not going to attract that attention. And if you don't have a good relation with your boss, like Eisenhower, who's going to publicize your success, which is the other thing that Mark Bloomson talked about, you've got to attract the press, and you've got to have success to blare about. If you're not getting that publicized as well, then there's just no traction to establish a reputation that historians are later going to get in and build off of. So, I mean, again, Devers was not, nobody paid much attention to him during the war, and it's hard to recover from that later. And I wish Scott luck, and I don't know if we'll ever get a tank named after him, because I would guarantee if I went to the Pentagon today and mentioned the name Jacob Devers, I might be able to find 3 people that knew him. It is, he's like John Yossop. He's just been forgotten in many ways. It's not right, but that's what's happened. I want to talk about a part of his career that is very much, forgot General's career, which is his period as the commander of the European Theater of Operations in 1943. In May 1943, General Frank Andrews, who is the initial commander of the American European Theater of Operations, is killed in a plane crash in Iceland. It's not surprising that the commander in the theater at that time was an airman, because the primary purpose at that time for the American forces in England was to build up for the air assault against Germany. So Andrews is the commander. He gets killed in May, and George Marshall turns to Jacob Devers, and puts him in charge of the theater, which is really surprising considering what the emphasis of the theater was. It's obvious the kind of confidence Marshall had in Devers to appreciate the utility of the air arm as well as the ground arm. And for the next 7 or 8 months, Devers' focus is going to be on building up forces in England. And not just air forces, but also the beginning of the ground force buildup for the invasion. The main guy he's working with is a Air Force general named Ira Aker. In many ways, he's kind of the Air Force's forgotten general in World War II. He's very much like Devers. He's in a lot of key places, a lot of great things, and is very much eclipsed by other generals that have more publicity and more publicized success. Aker was the records custodian for Billy Mitchell's court-martial. He is impressed with the problems of confrontation and public relations, and really sets out to become the Air Force's PR expert. But his focus is always on the service, not himself. He's always looking for things to make the Air Force's image better. He's always looking for ways to be successful. He is, until he gets fired by Hap Arnold, he is Hap Arnold. He's a good friend of Hap Arnold. And he spends 25 years in the Air Force coming up with Hap Arnold. And when Arnold has to pick somebody to establish and the 8th Air Force in England in 1943, well, it actually started in 1942, and to initiate the air campaign against Germany and to prove the utility and effectiveness of precision bombing doctrine, he picks Aker. And so Aker and Devers are going to become a real team in England trying to make this new idea of strategic bombing work. Now the problem is, one of the many problems that Aker and Devers have to deal with is the way that the Army Air Forces decide they're going to mount this campaign. So they realize that the big thing we have to do is we've got to build up a bomber force quickly. We've got to get a lot of bombers to England to execute this. So Devers and Aker are being sent all kinds of bombers and enough crews to fly the bombers, but all the emphasis on getting bombers and crews over, and what are they forgetting about? A little thing like logistics. They say that, amateurs study tactics, professionals study logistics. Well, they're not sending over the supplies, they're not sending over especially the maintenance people to service the airplanes, to fix the airplanes. So Aker's going to have a very hard time keeping his operational levels up because he doesn't have the guys to fix the airplanes. They're getting butchered in the skies over Germany. When a crewman shows up in 1943 to report into the 8th Air Force, they are told if you finish 25 missions, you get to go home. And then there's always a pause, and the briefer will say, but your expectancy is you'll do 6.5. And I've actually gone through statistics, and that through 1943 and early 1944, the average life expectancy of somebody in the 8th Air Force is about 6.5 missions. It's really a very deadly business. And the reason is because the tactics that they're trying out, which is unescorted daylight bombing. The British tried it early in the war, realized it wasn't going to work. But the Americans were convinced they could do it. They had better airplanes, better pilots. You had the B-17s and B-24s. They were supposed to be, B-17 is a flying fortress. It's got a dozen machine guns on it, and a guy named Curtis LeMay comes up with this design of how you're going to do. You're going to put them in boxes to defend themselves. I mean, precision bombing, which is portrayed in all the posters, is these bombers dropping bombs down smokestacks. In reality, it isn't very precise. I mean, you've got groups of 12 to 18 aircraft dropping their bombs at the same time on a lead bombardier, and the bombs are normally set to land about 400 feet apart on the ground. So each bomber is dropping a string of bombs that covers about 4,400 feet on the ground. You've got 18 of them. You're talking about a precision bombing footprint that covers about a square mile. That is not exactly, pickle barrel accuracy, as it's sometimes called. But that's the reality of the bombing, and it's a very deadly business. You have no fighter escort. It's you against the flak. It's you against the German fighters. And I want to describe one raid to kind of explain. This is what Aker and Devers are going through in 43. They decide that they find a target system that might be able to bring down the German economy, ball bearings. So in August 1943, they decide to go after the big ball bearing plant at Schweinfurt. Now remember, these are unescorted bombers. So how are you going to fool the Germans? How are you going to create some kind of diversion? So the idea is we're going to send in 2 bombardment divisions, about 150 bombers each. We're going to go after 2 deep targets, one at Schweinfurt, one at Regensburg. Regensburg is the big Messerschmitt factory. This is a deep penetration into Germany. Deep penetration right into Germany. They're going to be, they can get bomber escorts about to the German border, but from then on, they're on their own. You've got Curtis LeMay in charge of the 3rd Bombardment Division and a guy named Williams in charge of the 3rd Bombardment Division. Curtis LeMay is probably the best air commander of World War II. And anybody who's ever been to England, what is the normal morning weather like in England? Fog. We all know that. It's fog. So LeMay has taught his guys how to take off in fog. Now, it's not easy to organize 150 bombers taking off from disparate airfields and get them assembled in the middle of fog over England. And LeMay trains his guys how to do that. So on the morning of August 17th, weather's going to be good over Germany. These 2 bomb groups are giving their orders. They're going to take off at the same time, go into Germany, and at one point in Germany they will split. One group goes to Schweinfurt, one group goes to Regensburg, and the German fighters have to decide who to go after. The idea is one of these groups will probably be pretty clear to get to the target. Well, what happens is LeMay has trained his guys to take off in fog, and Williams has not. So what happens is the 3rd Bombardment Division gets up, and they're all deployed. The 1st Bombardment Division is still on the ground. So the commander of 8th Bomber Command and Aker, the guy named Anderson, he and Aker get together. What are we going to do? Well, they can't. The bombers are up. We're not going to bring them back down. So the decision is to send LeMay first and get Williams up when he can, which turns out to be 3 hours later. So instead of having the best plan, where you've got these 2 bomb groups keeping the Germans away from each other, instead what happens is the first group goes in, the German fighters decimated, then they get to land, drink a couple of cognacs, refuel the aircraft, and get ready for the next group that's coming 3 hours later. It's the worst of both worlds. You read descriptions from the 1st Bombardment Division going in, and as they're going towards the target, they said, wow, this is really convenient. Somebody's lit bonfires on the ground to show us where the targets are. Well, the bonfires were burning B-17s from the first group that had gone in. Of the 376 aircraft on the mission, 60 are shot down. And 80 will never fly again. LeMay's group, again, because of this intricate plan, they fly to North Africa. Williams's group goes back to England. LeMay's group goes to North Africa. And again, this problem of logistics. LeMay lands at a bunch of airfields in North Africa, and there's nobody there to meet him except a couple of camels and a little bit of fuel. So what LeMay has to do is scrounge enough parts from these decimated airplanes to get enough to fly his people back. And he eventually gets about 80 airplanes of his force of about 160 back to England. And of course, being LeMay, he decides to fly over Bordeaux and bomb somebody on the way home just to do something. But it's a disaster. It's a true disaster for precision bombing doctrine. This is, if you have a force of, 376 aircraft, you lose 60, that means basically your whole Air Force will be gone in 6 missions. That's not really very sustainable. So there's a pause, and in 14 October, Devers and Aker finally build up enough force so they can try it again. On 14 October, they go back to Schweinfurt. And this time they can get 291 bombers together. They head for Schweinfurt again, and it's very similar. That's 60 more bombers shot down, and 17 will never fly again. So that about 80, again, but you've lost about, this time they lost about 20% of the bombing force in one raid. With, each of those planes, there's 10 men on each of those planes as well. So you're not just losing bombers, you're losing a lot of people as well. So, at the 8th Air Force had lost 90 bombers in raids the week before. So the loss rate is just unsustainable. The need to replenish aircraft and then bad weather will basically stop any more deep penetration missions for the rest of 1943. In the same time, the Brits and Bomber Harris, Bomber Harris is one of these true icons of World War II. His campaign is he's dehousing German workers. That's the phrase they use for destroying German cities. There's a great story about Harris. He was caught speeding through the streets of London one night, and the British policeman said, "Sir, you could kill someone." And he turned to the man and said, "Young man, I kill thousands of people every night." And he got back to Scotland and grew up. But for the Americans, this is a disaster, and for Harris, it's a disaster as well. Harris will actually lose the whole frontline strength of Bomber Command in a series of raids over Berlin in December and January 1944. By the early 1944, end of 1943, the Allies are losing the air war in both the daylight and the night bombing, which is a potential disaster for, of course, the whole invasion effort. Yeah, they don't. That's right. They will. They don't have the fight. They don't have the P-51 Mustang. P-51 Mustang wins the air war, but that hasn't arrived yet. The irony though is for the Schweinfurt. Murphy is alive and well in World War II. For the October Schweinfurt raid, they were delivered P-38 Lightnings, which could make the long-term, which were not as good as the Mustang, but still do most of the way into Germany. They weren't available until the day after the raid. That's just the way things work. So what happens is now Arnold loses, there's a lot of angst in Washington. Hap Arnold loses complete faith in Acre. Devers defends him as best he can with letters back to Washington. He tells everyone Ira Acre is doing the best he can with the resources he's got. What happened was Ike will come back from the Mediterranean to take over the European theater of operations. He wants to bring Tui Spots with him, who's his air commander in the Mediterranean. Arnold is going to fire Acre. It's framed, but now Spots is involved in this too. Spots is uneasy to leave the Mediterranean completely in British hands and wants to have a very competent air commander there. He realizes Acre is the best that's available, and he wants Acre to go to the Mediterranean. He wants Acre to have a primary command slot in the Mediterranean. Acre does not want to go. He rightly sees this as being fired from his beloved 8th Air Force. But Spots basically says, "I'm not going to England unless Acre comes to the Med because we got to keep competent leaders in both areas." So what happens is Spots will come to England, Acre goes to the Mediterranean, Acre sends a telegram to George Marshall and says, "Why are they doing this to me?" Marshall defends Acre with Eisenhower. Eisenhower argues, he uses some of Spots' argument that we got to have good commanders in both theaters. I want to have my team with me. And Marshall eventually accedes to Ike's desires and puts Spots in England and allows Acre to go to the Mediterranean. And of course, who else goes to the Med at that time? Jake Devers. So again, Devers and Acre will go to the Mediterranean, at least for a short time, to be together again. There are some ironies here, and just to kind of finish the Acre story, Acre becomes commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces. They bring a guy named Nathan Twining from the Pacific to command the 15th Air Force. How many people know a lot about the 15th Air Force? The 15th Air Force is the forgotten Air Force. Another talk about forgotten. The 8th Air Force gets all the glory. Everybody knows that about the 8th Air Force. Well, there are two Air Forces bombing Germany. The 8th Air Force from England and the 15th Air Force from Italy. And the 15th Air Force, again, we've got Devers involved with logistics and all kinds of things in the Mediterranean. The 15th Air Force is set up in Italy. Acre in charge of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces will help build up the 15th Air Force. And when you look at the actual bombing results in World War II, the best bombing Air Force in World War II is the 15th Air Force. But nobody knows about it. Again, the publicity belongs to organizations as well. I mean, this whole thing about, and one of the themes of my talk really is this, how images get made, how reputations get made. The same thing happens at Devers and Acre that happens at 15th Air Force. If you don't have somebody that's really trumpeting your accomplishments, if you don't have somebody who's really, if you don't attract the attention of the press initially, you can't make up for that. I mean, historians, as Martin Blumenson said, historians tend to follow the record that's already been laid out there by the press. He's correct. Everybody loved George Patton. He was flamboyant. He often said wrong things that you could, they portrayed as good as well as bad. I had certain advantages in making certain subordinates well known. The Third Army. It's interesting. I've met so many veterans in the Third Army. I don't think I've ever met any veteran who bragged he was from the First Army. He mentioned Simpson's Ninth Army. How many people have heard of the Simpsons Ninth Army? Another very good organization. But they don't get the PR. They don't have the reputation. It's sad. It's a sad way that history gets written. And historians tend to write about things that people already know about, except for somebody like Scott. And Scott's always been a strange bird anyway. You gotta understand that Scott's too big. People he writes about are Jacob Devers and Oliver Cromwell. There's a real good mix for you. We're trying to put the personalities together. But it's a sad note about history that often the people historians write about are not always the people that ought to be written about. And that's why there's still a lot of field out there for aspiring historians to go out and make the record straight. So that's my presentation.
Thank you, John. Again, we're a few minutes ahead of schedule, so let's see if there's questions. Start here in the front.
You're talking about image, and I was always trying to figure out why I didn't like General Devers or Bradley or whatever, and I read two things. One of them made me smile. They didn't like his smile. They thought it was a smirk. And the other was, you were talking about the bombers, that Eisenhower requested some of those bombers be placed elsewhere, and Devers refused him. And that infuriated Ike, and he never liked him from then on. Does that sound?
No, that's part of it. I mean, Scott's got some great stories about a visit Devers makes to North Africa in late 42, early 43, where Ike is at a low point, and Devers is very cheerful but also very critical, and Ike sees him as a potential replacement, and that he's got some. That's a good question to save for Scott and ask him as well. That helps poison the relationship early. But you are correct. One of the problems during 1943 is every time Ike gets in a bind, especially at Salerno, the landings at Salerno are a near debacle, and Ike immediately goes back and says, I need 3 squadrons of bombers to help bail us out. And this is right when, we're talking the middle of 1943, when Akers was having a major crisis and trying to get precision bombing to work. They really need those bombers to make those attacks into Europe. And Ike is demanding the diversion of these bombers for the Mediterranean. Eventually he will get them, but there's a real dispute, and you're correct. Devers is caught in the middle between Ike's demands for help in the Mediterranean and Akers' pleas, I need these bombers to make this work. And yeah, that also helps poison the relationship as well.
Way in the back. Yes, sir.
When Eisenhower replaced Devers, did Devers feel like he was fired also?
I'll see a little bit this to Scott. Devers always knew that Ike was kind of coming back. There's this discussion about who's going to lead the invasion. Is it going to be George Marshall? Is it going to be, I guess Devers' name gets thrown around there as well. But everybody knows Ike has been chosen to lead the invasion, so it's going to happen. Devers was always the good soldier. I mean, Devers was not, there's a book I recommend everybody that they read, Eisenhower at War. It's written by David Eisenhower. It's a very boring book, I must say, because what he does is he goes through every minute of Ike's day from 1943 through 1945. And one of the striking things when you read about the last part of the war, especially from late 44 to late 45, is Ike is having major problems with one very large prima donna in his headquarters, of his subordinates. It's not George Patton, it's not Bernard Montgomery, it's Omar Bradley. When you read and look at the problems Bradley is giving Ike with Bradley's ego problems, I mean, this is very different than the image that you get anywhere else. And Jake Devers was not that kind of a problem child. I mean, he had enough problems dealing with the French. I mean, you'll get some of that from Scott. But Jake was always a good soldier. He did not push back. When he was told to do something, he did it. And again, he didn't leave these little blips of controversy for historians to grab onto to turn into big stories. That was not Jake Devers.
Please, in the back.
What kind of relationship did he have with Churchill? He was the theater.
No, he was good. I mean, Churchill had his favorites, and he had people he liked better. And I'm sure Scott's got more details on than I did. But from my perspective, you know, Churchill was standing by, watching what was going on, but he knew that Ike was going to be the guy as well. He's involved in the decision making there. You know, Jake filled his role, but everybody knew that he was not going to be the final guy. And Ike, you know, even Scott will say nice things about Eisenhower for his capabilities as coalition commander. That was what he was good at, and everybody knew it.
One more, please.
Alan Brooks thought that Eisenhower was plainly incompetent, and he made it very well known in his memoirs later on. Whether it was justified or not is besides the point. But he felt, and as you look at it and so on, the Germans didn't have much, but you take the Battle of the Bulge and everything like that. Ike was a great person at getting everyone together, and he was a communicator. There's no question about it. But we had so much more than the Germans had, and look how long it took us to do what they had. Plus, the Germans were fighting the Russians in the Eastern Front. And with few exceptions, if you really look at the picture, the Allies in the Western Front really didn't do a great job.
Well, you're going to have two good discussions of lost opportunities in Northwest Europe coming up, and I'd say that there's a lost opportunity for the ability of the Devers to cross the Rhine. There's also a lost opportunity in Falaise in 1944 to break the German army, which one of the things that Blumenson was beating up Ambrose at the session that you saw a few of the clips on. Yes, we've got more discussion of that coming up. I also recommend to you Lord Alan Brooke's memoirs. I mean, yes, he didn't like Ike, but Alan Brooke really didn't like anybody. I mean, he didn't like Montgomery. It's interesting that the people that Alan Brooke liked best is he thought Douglas MacArthur was a brilliant strategist and Joseph Stalin. He really liked them. Those are rated very highly, but pretty much everybody else gets slammed in his book. But it's an interesting read. It's an interesting read.
It is useful to think about that moment at the end of 1943, beginning of 1944, when Ike comes to London. Remember that Patton has just fallen on bad times because of the slapping incident. Having been the 7th Army commander in Sicily with Bradley as a corps commander, those relationships are now going to change, and Bradley will become an Army commander for the landing. And it's at that moment that you see that Eisenhower gets to pick, because our boy, Jake Devers, is clearly senior to Bradley at that point. So if you look at it that way, at that little triumvirate, I think you'll begin to see how the Devers as a good soldier, Devers as a loyal contributor, really becomes very, very clear to all of us, and think about those possibilities.
Good morning. And thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been here in the past. I was doing some research for my book on Devers' decision in Strasbourg. It's a great archive here, particularly for Devers. And I also spoke here, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago, not here, but somewhere at a club nearby, and I was talking about my book on Devers. My name is David Colley, and I've written about 5-6 books on World War II. One of them just recently came out 2 weeks ago, called Seeing the War, which is a compendium of photographs, famous photographs of the war, and with a detailed explanation of what happened to the men in those photographs. And it was a really fascinating, it was kind of a hobby, been going on for 20 years or more. When I was a kid growing up after the war, I was looking at all these photographs and getting to know the men vicariously. Decided to find out what actually happened to them, and so researched that, and a book just came out. And one of the photos in the book is General Devers. The section on Devers relates to the 3 men who might have been the Supreme Commander in Europe, replacing Eisenhower. Devers, as we've talked about, was the European commander in '43, and the other man was Frank Andrews, who was mentioned here, who was killed, a very highly respected Air Force general. And the other general who I think was pretty seriously considered, or would have been, was Vinegar Joe Stilwell, who was considered at the beginning of the war to be a very fine general, and I was considered as the commander of American forces in North Africa. Unfortunately for Stilwell, he was an expert on China, and Marshall wanted him in China to keep China in the war. As I mentioned, among the books that I've written is Decision at Strasbourg about General Devers' 6th Army Group and his plan, Devers' plan to cross the Rhine River near Strasbourg in November 1944 in an attempt to unhinge the German front line and possibly bring a quick end to the war in Europe. We know now that he never made that crossing. This is just a generalized view of this is Devers' army, this is where he wanted to cross the Rhine, and this is where the Battle of the Bulge took place. These are the northern armies up there. I often wonder why this fascinating piece of military history, Devers' attempt to cross the Rhine, is so ignored in contemporary accounts of the war. One reason generals often lay down the history of wars, and all the major commanders, Eisenhower, Bradley, Montgomery, and Patton, wrote their side of and versions of events. Devers never did write a memoir where he might have explained how his cross-line plan might have shortened the war. I think such an account would have attracted attention. So without any kind of rebuttal, Devers' attempt to cross the Rhine is lost and is often dismissed as an unworkable plan for any number of reasons. Not enough supplies, too small an army to make a difference, the wrong place near the Black Forest, and miles from where the fighting was concentrated farther north. But in reality, I believe, it was a great opportunity by a relatively unknown general, Devers, and his unknown 6th Army Group to have a major impact on the outcome of the war. The Rhine was the enemy's last major defensive barrier, and to breach it anywhere would have disrupted the German front line from the Netherlands to the Swiss frontier. The German generals would have had to have reacted to the incursion, and no matter how small it was. Look what happened during the Battle of the Bulge, excuse me, when the Germans struck in December 1944 in the Ardennes. The Americans rushed as many as 5 divisions, and at least to contain the German army, the advance, 2 airborne divisions, 101st and the 82nd, and at least 3 divisions from Patton's 3rd Army. The diversion of these units stretched the American front in Alsace and Lorraine, and Devers' 7th Army moved into positions formerly occupied by Patton's troops. The Germans took advantage of the thinly held American line by attacking in Alsace in January 1945. Just as the Americans had to rush troops to contain the Bulge, the Germans would have had to have rushed troops to the Strasbourg area to contain an American bridgehead across the Rhine. And by the end of 1944, the enemy had few reserves with which to counter any kind of serious incursion into German territory. What reserves they had on the Western Front were massing at that time for the Battle of the Bulge. and had the enemy been forced to send them to Strasbourg, the Allies would have taken advantage of their weakness farther to the north, and a Devers breakthrough at Rastatt, just north of Strasbourg, may even have prevented the Battle of the Bulge, which took place a month later in December 1944, where 19,000 Americans were killed and 60,000 were made casualties. We know from history that General Eisenhower, the supreme commander in Europe, ordered Devers not to cross. It came after a heated argument at Devers' headquarters in Vittel in Alsace. Devers was furious and tried to persuade Eisenhower to allow the attack to proceed, noting that his troops were ready to go and that he had always been taught to reinforce strength, and he believed he had that kind of strength to cross the Rhine. Devers pleaded that Patton was stuck in the mud at Metz and that a Rhine crossing would force the German First Army facing Patton to fall back to the Rhine. Devers also told a skeptical Eisenhower and General Bradley, who accompanied Ike on that fateful trip, that Allied patrols had crossed the Rhine all along the river from Rastatt in the 7th Army sector to Belfort in the French Army sector, and found the west wall defenses sparse and unmanned. There's a shot of, this is Devers on the Rhine in 1945, but it is a picture of how they probably would have crossed Pontoon Bridge. Devers is on the left and an unknown lieutenant on the right. If a cross-Rhine attack had failed, Devers added, he was prepared to bring the troops back across the river. Eisenhower feared that thousands of U.S. troops could be stranded and taken prisoner on the east bank of the Rhine if the venture failed. It should be pointed out, however, that the Germans went back and forth across the Rhine all the time. So why couldn't the Americans if the attack petered out? We had better resources than they had, and including dominant air power. Devers and his commanders also wanted to cross the Rhine to forestall possible German counterattacks that they expected across the river, from across the river to dislodge the 7th Army from the Strasbourg area. Devers' fears about a possible German counterattack were realized 6 weeks later during Operation Northwind, when thousands of enemy troops poured over the Rhine to attack Devers' stretched forces north of Strasbourg. Eisenhower was unmoved by Devers' plan to cross the Rhine and ordered him not to proceed with the planned attack and advance instead to the north. If I can get this. North of along the west bank of the Rhine to support Patton's 3rd Army in Lorraine. This is where Patton was, right here, U.S. 3rd Army. This is the German front, right here. This is Devers' 7th Army coming up from southern France. You can see what Devers wanted to do was to cross at Strasbourg, go up or down the Rhine, come in behind the German First Army in this salient here. The west wall comes like this, and then it crosses the Rhine and comes down the Rhine, and this is the area that Devers' patrols had found virtually unmanned. This, however, when Eisenhower told Devers to move north, they would be moving into a very strong belt of defenses. Devers was dismayed by this order, since it meant his 7th Army would have to fight its way through a strong belt of German pillboxes and tank traps in the west wall. The defenses across the Rhine on the east bank, where he had intended to attack, were far less formidable. Ike's new order meant that the fight would turn into a slogging match like the Hurtgen Forest, where the Germans had the advantage and shattered several American infantry divisions. Being the team player that Devers was, and that's been pointed out today, he obeyed Ike's orders, but he and his generals were dismayed, to say the least. General Wade Hayslip, Devers' 15th Corps commander, stated that his troops were prepared to cross the Rhine, and General Alexander Patch, he had been a combat veteran in the Pacific before coming to France. Patch, 7th Army commander, said, "By not crossing the Rhine, Ike," and I quote, "forfeited a chance on a shortcut to the heart of southern Germany." Even Patton, who would have been denied the glory of being first over the Rhine, stated that Devers should have been permitted to cross. Patton also said he would have gone with her without orders, and when he did cross in 1945, he did it secretly. To understand why Devers was denied the attempt for such a bold move over the Rhine, we need to put the episode in context. After the D-Day landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and a 6-week struggle to break out of the area, the Allies in late July drove the disintegrating German 7th Army back to Germany's borders by September. They landed here. This is 3rd Army, probably 1st Army. These were 12th Army Group, and Montgomery's 21st Army Group. They drove the Germans back to the German border. The Supreme Command's SHAEF plan was for the Allied armies to advance en masse on a broad front, grouped in 21st Army Group under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and 12th Army Group commanded by General Omar Bradley. When the opportunity arose, thrusts would be made to capture the Ruhr and the Saar industrial areas. Right in here, somewhere in this is the Saar area, Saarbrücken, and the Ruhr is further up here. Both those industrial areas supplied the German war machine. But otherwise, the Allied armies stayed pretty much abreast of each other, and by September 1944, the Germans had regrouped and were able to check the Allies all along the west wall that protected the German border. The Allies were greatly extended along that border and were running short on supplies and low on manpower. Heavy fighting by the Americans around Aachen, Germany, in Germany's Hürtgen Forest and at Metz in France had failed to break through the German west wall into the heart of the Reich. The Allies even tried an end run around the German west wall defenses at Arnhem in the Netherlands in mid-September, a battle we today remember as a bridge too far. But that also came to nothing. The Germans held and the Allies wouldn't move forward for 6 months, and in December they were clobbered in the Battle of the Bulge. It took the Allies 6 weeks of heavy fighting to drive the Germans back to their starting point and begin the advance into the Reich. It didn't start until February 1945. All the while, 12th and 21st Army Groups were stalled. Devers' 6th Army Group had advanced from southern France all the way into Alsace, all the way down here from the Marseille-Toulon area, all the way up. And by November, reached the Rhine at Strasbourg. The Rhine was a major objective of the Supreme Command. Reach the Rhine on a broad front and then breach it, destroy the German army and race to capture Berlin, if possible. Those were the standing orders from SHAEF to the various armies, including 6th Army Group. Devers and his commanders, General Patch and Hayslip, took those orders seriously and were preparing for a crossing in what they hoped would be a classic envelopment move in accordance with SHAEF's directives for all his armies, all their armies. This is a shot of an engineering group on flat-bottom boats practicing transporting infantry that they would have transported across the Rhine. This is on the Dobbs River. It was slower than the Rhine. This river moved at about 3 miles an hour. The Rhine somewhere between 5 and 6 miles an hour, I believe. But they still wanted to train these guys to go across, so they would go across either on ducks, amphibious trucks, or they would go on bridge equipment or flat-bottom boats. Devers and his except these directives to the other armies to breach the Rhine were not supposed to relate to 6th Army Group. Ike made this plain on his visit to Devers' headquarters late in November, the day before 6th Army Group was preparing to cross the Rhine. Bridging equipment and amphibious trucks were on the move towards the river when Ike ordered it to stop. But why? Why stop an attack that might have rendered a fatal blow to the enemy? After all, everyone else along the front was stalled. To begin with, Devers' Army Group was something of an afterthought, an orphan to the Northern Army Groups and to Eisenhower. It landed in southern France in August 1944, 2 months after D-Day, and the Supreme Command never expected it to perform well or to be much of a factor in defeating the German army in the West. In fact, it was not under SHAEF's control. when it landed and was incorporated under Schaiff's command on September 15th, 44. The lack of respect for 6th Army Group was due in part because the Army Group was at first consisted of only one corps, 6th Corps, 3 divisions commanded by General Lucien Truscott on the right, on the left, excuse me. That's Devers on the left, Patch in the center. 6th Corps, however, had the most experienced divisions in the Army. The 3rd, the 45th, and the 36th, all veterans from Italy, from where they had been transferred to make the invasion of southern France. Beside these 3 divisions, wrapped into the 7th Army, 6th Army Group was also comprised of the 1st French Army commanded by General de Lattre de Tassigny, center. Devers on his right, Marshall on his left. He could be a very fickle commander. The French 1st was under-equipped. It was only equipped by the Americans. They wore pretty much American equipment, helmets, although these guys don't look as if they're wearing American helmets. Uniforms, boots, etc. Tanks, trucks, everything was American. But it was as I say, it was under-equipped, filled with North African colonials unused to the Northern European climate and racked by factions. It's an understatement to say that Eisenhower and Schaiff didn't give much respect to the 1st French Army, and they did have some difficulty. Schaiff's idea for the 6th Army Group was that once it moved through southern France, it would link with Patton's 3rd Army in Lorraine, where it was to act as a flank guard protecting Patton's 3rd Army and the armies further north, operating in Belgium and Luxembourg. In short, 6th Army Group really never fit into Schaiff's prepared plan on how to defeat the Wehrmacht, and Schaiff rigidly adhered to a pre-Overlord plan for the defeat of Germany in the West that applied to 12th and 21st Army Groups, not to 6th Army Group. General Walter Bedell Smith, Ike's Chief of Staff, wrote, "Looking back over the 11 months of fighting which were required to defeat the German armies, I can say very sincerely that I do not believe a great campaign has ever been fought before with so little change in its original strategic plan. The grand strategy for Overlord, which was agreed on at Schaiff before the troops were even put on board ship and for the invasion, was followed almost without alteration. Tactical changes were made as the German reaction called for it, but the strategic plan was not changed. Devers and 6th Army Group were never included in the pre-Overlord plan, and even when they took their place on the Northern Front, they still were excluded." Devers and his 6th Army Group lost out because he was a victim, I believe, of what might be called office politics and an old boy network. He was never a favorite of Eisenhower, nor Bradley or Patton, for that matter, and Patton called him 22 caliber. And we have a dispute. It was in my research says that Patton called Devers 22 caliber, even as Devers led his army to the Rhine, and Patton was stalemated at Metz. Devers was also operating some distance removed from the northern armies. It was not part of that select group of generals. Whenever Ike met with his commanders, it was usually in the north, and Devers was not invited. A photo of Ike's coterie of generals on the Western Front does not include Devers, even though Devers, as an Army Group commander, outranked most of those generals and had seniority over most of them. So if Ike were going to give the go-ahead to one of his generals in his network to break through German defenses and capture the headlines, it wasn't going to be Devers. It would be Bradley, Patton, or Montgomery, or somebody else. International politics also played a role. Eisenhower had to be sensitive to British needs, even as the war in Europe increasingly became an American show. The Americans had twice as many troops on the Western Front as the British, yet for the sake of harmony between the two countries, he had to be nice to Montgomery, who was always complaining that Ike didn't know what he was doing. Ike had to fight off Montgomery's plan for a deep thrust into Germany with a combination of American and British troops to capture Berlin. He came close to firing Montgomery and replacing him with a more pliable British commander. But Montgomery was the darling of the British press and people. He had defeated Rommel in the North African desert and at a time when Britain needed a hero, and Monty became their hero of the war. Montgomery and other British generals considered Ike to be a plodding, cautious commander who knew little about ground warfare. After all, the largest unit he'd ever commanded before World War II was a company of about 150 men, and that was for only about 6 months. But Ike knew the war was won. It was just a matter of time before the Germans collapsed, and he didn't want to take what he believed were unnecessary chances, like a Rhine crossing around Strasbourg. He had been burned at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in 1943, and this debacle could have cost him the supreme command, and he didn't want another Kasserine. He would take the slow, cautious route to victory, grinding away with pre-planned strategy that he knew would work in the end. The problem with that strategy is that it was costly in men, in the Hurtgen and later in the Battle of the Bulge. Schaeff was so wedded to their plan that they missed several breakthrough opportunities on the Western Front besides Strasbourg. British General Brian Horrocks, commander of, I believe, British Second Corps, had a straight shot at the Rhine in late August and early September. That's what he reported, but it was never exploited. U.S. Fifth Corps had another opportunity in September on the border of Luxembourg and Germany. With more troops, General Giraud, Fifth Corps commander, might have pushed to the Rhine. Several German generals have said so. This action occurred the same week that 100,000 U.S. and British troops were attempting to take the bridge at Arnhem. Just think of what a few thousand of those troops would have done for General Giraud. And south of Strasbourg, General Lucien Trescott, Devers Corps commander before Haslip, was considered by many, including Eisenhower, to be one of the best, if not the best, commander of the U.S. Army, combat commander, wanted to thrust through the Belfort Gap south of Strasbourg in Alsace. Had he done so and succeeded, as he believed he would have been in a position to cross the Rhine south of Strasbourg or move up the river or down the river, West Bank, to cut off the German 19th Army. Truscott was so angry at not being able to exploit the Belfort Gap that he suggested a better use of his corps would be to send it back to Italy, where it came from. He really did. Would Devers have succeeded had he crossed the Rhine at Rastatt? There are enough generals and observers, including German generals, who believe Devers would have succeeded. Devers' chief engineer, General Garrison Davidson, a future West Point commandant and 7th Army commander in Europe during the Cold War, believed strongly that a crossing would have succeeded. Davidson was absent at the meeting between Ike and Devers, but he later wrote, and I quote, excuse me, I wish I could have been in on that high-level meeting, for I doubt that anyone there really understood the extent of our engineering preparations and therefore the high probability of a swift crossing that could be sustained. The point of this reflection is that the forethought and planning of the engineer section of the 7th Army provided the Supreme Commander with an opportunity to defeat from his broad front strategy, to depart from his broad front strategy, then abundantly apparent to the Germans, and make a lightning thrust across the Rhine in the Rastatt-Strasbourg area. Affording him this opportunity seemed to be a major contribution to the combat effort. That was diplomatically stated. Later, he apparently wrote a more critical analysis in which he argued that by not crossing, the Allies lost a huge opportunity to shorten the war. Had Devers gone, it probably would have been the biggest event of his military career, for better or for worse. Had he succeeded, he would have become famous, and if nothing else, people would have at least known how to pronounce his name. Even at the height of the European campaign, he was so obscure that people didn't know if his name was pronounced Devers or Devers. Had he succeeded, maybe they would have come to know him as fondly as Jake or Jakey, and he would have been as well known as Patton, Bradley, and Montgomery. Conferences like this will help make him better known. I have one last slide here that you might find fun and interesting. This was a true comic book published in 1943. It's the story of Jacob Devers. There are about 4 or 5 other pages to it. I don't know where you could find a copy of that today, but it's somewhere on the web. And with that, I close and thank you very much.
We have a couple minutes for the questions. We're still doing okay, please.
Marshall seemed to have a due respect for Devers. Was he involved at all in this Strasbourg decision? And if not, why not?
I think this was essentially Devers' doing. I think Marshall was, to a large extent, hands-off. And I don't know of any situation where Devers asked permission from Marshall or got any information or approval from Marshall. He was pretty much on his own. And as I think we're understanding here today, Devers was a very good general, and he knew his stuff. And it's interesting because he did have a very small staff. If you study 12th Army Group, Bradley's headquarters was just bristling with lieutenants and all kinds of advisors. Devers' staff was quite small. I don't know exactly how many, but he relied on his generals and their staff to do what they did. And they were, generally speaking, they were very good generals. Patch had been blooded, so to speak, on Guadalcanal. He was chosen. Marshall, I think, may have had a hand in appointing Patch because of his experience. Eisenhower wanted Truscott for Northern Europe. Devers wouldn't give him to him, and he became the 15th Corps commander for a while. Considered a very fine general. Hayslip, also a very good general.
Another one, please. All the way to standing in the back.
I was curious, I read a little bio on General Devers this morning. Coming from this area here, he has a very, very, I would call conservative background, basic Republican values, which is unusual for this city, of integrity, honesty, and doing a good job. I got the impression he was quite fanatic in the Army. Is that one of his big problems was anybody who's ever been in the military, when you circumvent your commanding officer to go over his head, but the year and deep into it. And I get the impression he did that more than once.
You might have to let Scott speak to that.
Yeah, we'll have time for Scott to take that.
Yeah.
And it's a good observation.
Yeah.
In this case, I think we've had a good point where he certainly didn't do an end run on Eisenhower, the theater commander, and go to Marshall. It would have been one of the ways you could have been a maverick and survived. Instead, as we heard earlier, team player, team player, team player. So we'll come back to that. It's a good question.
Yeah. I would only say one thing, and that is that I think my impression, and this is my impression, is that Devers was something of what you might call a goody-goody compared to the other commanders. I mean, you take Eisenhower, he was pretty rough and tumble growing up. He was a big football player, he got in fights all the time. I don't know about, I mean, certainly we know Patton was sort of no goody-goody. And I think he may have rubbed the other guys the wrong way because he was exactly what you say, upstanding, kind of valued, he adhered to solid, conventional, conservative values. Other guys didn't necessarily do that.
One more, and then we'll move on. Way in the back.
You mentioned that Eisenhower had very limited combat command experience. Did Devers have any small unit combat command experience?
Not
That's
combat.
again for Scott, but I don't think
that's for
so.
Scott.
Yeah.
Not combat experience, but lots of troop experience. So we'll probably have a chance to discuss that in more detail. There was one more, since we didn't really answer that one.
Okay, yes.
You didn't speak much about the Colmar Pocket and those mountains.
No, I didn't. And, well, the Colmar Pocket, if I could.
It's sort of a mess for with the Allies and the Germans.
Colmar Pocket would have been right there, right down, well, you can't even see it. Here's Colmar.
You can see it, you can see it.
Right in here. And the German 19th Army was kind of,
Yeah, you got it.
yeah,
There's a little south
situated in here. And it was a thorn in Devers' side and Eisenhower's side. Eisenhower was always complaining to Devers, get rid of the Colmar pocket. And I think Devers was very much aware of it. I think Scott can address that also. But one of the things that's interesting, Eisenhower was very concerned about Colmar pocket. Devers was not that concerned. He felt that the French could take care of the Colmar pocket. He was wrong, but the Colmar pocket was not really much of a danger. And while Eisenhower harped about the Colmar pocket, he was totally blind to what was going on to the north in the Ardennes. Suddenly 250,000 Germans attacked through the Ardennes. So there was, I think there was a little bit of you know, he wasn't on Bradley's back to do something to say more aggressive patrolling in the Ardennes area. And I know that Patton said that, I think Patton said that if he had been in command of that area, the Battle of the Bulge would have never happened because he would have done some very aggressive patrolling. But yes, the Colmar pocket was a problem for both Ike and Devers.
Also, I think I wonder what would have happened if we wouldn't have had Devers getting along with the French. He was a diplomat for the French.
He had a liaison in Henry Cabot Lodge, and who spoke French, was able to deal with the French diplomatically. Devers, Ticini, Delattre would occasionally drive Devers insane, but he persisted and got along with him fairly well. Delattre would get mad and go out and slam the door and then come back in, and they'd have to discuss the issue all over again. But he had relatively good relations with the French, particularly with using Henry Cabot Lodge as the liaison.
First rate, thank you. Scott Wheeler, the author of the Devers biography, is next up.
I can't tell you how much I appreciated the three presentations before me, and so I won't rehash that, but Rich needs to continue doing what he's doing because character matters in any pursuit, especially when soldiers' lives are at stake. And Devers was incredibly loyal. Ike wrote some things not flattering in his officer efficiency reports, but he also stressed every time that when the decision was made, Jake followed it loyally. There was no going around. He didn't freelance it. Last but not least, he had the patronage of two people that really mattered in World War II, George Marshall and Leslie McNair. So he had plenty of protectors above him that were pretty important. A couple of real quick questions because I really want Rich to pursue his work, but when the big question is, why did Ike not listen to Jake? As Dave Colley has pointed out, real opportunity was missed, and that, no matter how it would have transpired, it was a real opportunity. Whether or not it would have succeeded, I don't know, but it would have changed the course, and I think you really contributed an excellent book. And so my question is, where did this dysfunctional relationship come from? And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's different than what we talked about last night, because clearly a very dysfunctional relationship exists between Dwight Eisenhower and Jacob L. Devers. Just a teeny little thing, the way this relationship was soured a little bit on Ike's part is, in December of '43, when Ike makes the decision to send Jake to the Mediterranean, Jake is walking down the street of London on the 27th of December and notices in the paper that General Devers is going to the Mediterranean. That's piss poor personal relationships. I've enjoyed that. I think these are things that Jay really makes clear. I just want to reiterate them. This is an opportunity. Why won't Ike listen to Devers? Because everything David said is true. Gar Davidson had planned it, they had rehearsed it. 15th Corps had actually practiced with the 44th and 79th Infantry Divisions. They were ready to go. And that's the opportunity, and I don't need to stress that. It would have done some things anyway. So my point is, why in the world won't you listen to one of your three senior subordinates? Especially after they had steady success from the minute they landed in the south of France all the way up, killing and capturing 150,000 Germans. reaching the Rhine on the 19th and 24th of November, which is months ahead of anyone else getting to the Rhine. Why don't you listen to this guy? And there's another incident where Ike came close to totally destroying the post-war alliance when he was willing to give up the city of Strasbourg without a fight, turned 650,000 Frenchmen back over to the Gestapo and their revenge. And again, Devers flew to Paris and said, you can't do this for military and political reasons, and I totally basically shut up, go back, execute the order. And Devers was almost relieved over this one. So my question is, where did this go wrong? Because if this offensive had been allowed to carry out, it would have been a post-war political disaster. You can't even imagine NATO if the French hate us that much, and they would have hated us that much. You're looking at human beings, as I've said last night, and I really believe Ike was a great coalition commander. It's the right man for the job. He did a tremendous job, but he, like all of us, had some human weaknesses. One of them is he had less than a year of troop time. Jake had 14 years. They had incredibly different personalities. Ike is your penultimate committee man. Sorry, Lord. And did a terrific job of that. He's a political general, and that's why President Roosevelt picked him, which means in Roosevelt's case, he can get along with people. He understands compromise is not a four-letter word. You've got to get along with allies because they matter, especially when you're trying to fight in Europe and you're over in America and you need a springboard. That's called England. So we needed them as much as they needed us. That's Devers. Everything that goes into that sport is Devers' personality. Aggressive with troops, aggressive with his sports. He played varsity football in New York. He was on the varsity basketball team at West Point, and he loved polo for some of those same reasons. Here's his troop experience just in a nutshell. About 14 years with soldiers, understood how to feed soldiers. You don't feed your company or battery, you don't get anything done during the day. I'm here to tell you from personal experience. And so Jake knew that, and that was critical. I didn't disagree with that. But there's a huge difference from having to get up in those mornings in the cold winter and make sure the coffee's going for your troops at 5 in the morning versus having 6 or 7 months of command in the States, and that's it. And so they had different views on a whole bunch of things. Ike got about that far forward to the front. He didn't have his pulse on the battlefield, and I want to say clearly, he shouldn't have. His job as Supreme Commander is to do a whole bunch of different things at a different level. And so it's not a criticism, but it's a point out that they have very different perspectives on the way the world works. And Jake could never have done Ike's job to the level Ike did it. I think he could have done it, but not to the level Ike did. Because he didn't, number one, he didn't like the British. Jake was a go-forward. He visited every division, French and American, in Italy at least once or twice while they were in combat. Because he was a theater commander, he didn't have to do that, but he knew he had to get forward to see that they were getting the right clothes, the right replacements, the right training, plenty of ammunition, and to know how the rotation was going. And so that was the right job for Jake. I couldn't do that job as well and did not do that job as well in North Africa or when he was the Mediterranean commander. Different personalities, not one better or bad, or worse or whatever. Now, there's been a lot of speculation on when in the heck did these two men become dysfunctional related. And it begins, in my opinion, most people date it from the bomber dispute, but it really begins from a visit Jake will make to North Africa in 1942-43. It'll be re-emphasized by the bomber disputes in July and August in 1943. And then the fact that Jake gets an army group with Marshall's patronage, I think Ike would have liked a different solution. Maybe Truscott, I don't know. In November, December 1942, the U.S. Army is getting clobbered. We've invaded northern Africa. Our tanks are inadequate. In the upper right corner is a tank 14 feet tall. It's called a Target. It's the M3 Grant, and the Germans love to shoot it, and they can't really kill in the back because it doesn't have a turret with a big gun in it. It's a bad design. They were worried about that. The Germans have just deployed the Tiger tank for the first time in December 1942. When the American tank battalions and units ran into the Germans, we'd lose half of our tanks, be driven off the battlefield, and the infantrymen would be left to the Germans. That's why, for example, Patton's son-in-law was captured by the Germans. He was in the 1st Armor Regiment. Our tactics sucked, our anti-tank guns were inadequate, and our training was poor, and our equipment was bad. Can't tell the people on the home front that, because you want them to keep buying war bonds. But when he went there, he visited all the armor units across North Africa, British and American, gathered a tremendous amount of information about technical aspects, tanks, doctrine, training, organization. And on the way out, on the 3rd of January, he meets with Eisenhower, and he spends the night with Ike at Ike's headquarters. And Jake is a real optimist. He is totally insensitive to where General Eisenhower is at that point. Ike is being hounded by Marshall to get forward. He is being questioned by Churchill whether or not he's adequate. Alan Brooke, as someone has commented, thought he was definitely inadequate. And he had huge problems, not to speak of. He had pneumonia, his blood pressure was over 140, and he's smoking 4 packs a day. Other than that, it was a good day for Eisenhower. And the campaign is totally bogged down. So Jakey comes there after investigating everything, and smiling, Jake says, "Gosh, good to see you, Ike. How's it going? Let me tell you how the war's going. 1st Armor's scattered all around, not being used properly," which is true. And he tells him that, and on and on and on for hours. Not good. And Ike already believes that Jake has been sent there to understudy Ike. Now, I can't prove that, so I've got to tell you that. But remember, when Eisenhower got his command, he had been sent to England to understudy Cheney. Or not to understudy by Marshall on purpose. Came back, said everything's goofed up. Marshall said, "Well, what do we need? A good guy? Great, you're it." So I'm sure, personally, and I, again, can't prove it, that Eisenhower saw the pattern being repeated because of all those other things that had happened. And Jake would have been the logical choice. Head of the armored force in a battle that's all about armor. So I think that there's this insecurity from a guy who missed the bet. Jake was totally insensitive about how he's being perceived, both by Ike on the 3rd of January and then when he talks to Patton on the 5th and 6th. And I think this is the beginning of their relationship because from then on, I believe Eisenhower is looking over his shoulder. If I falter, this guy gets it. What's the best way to keep him sidelined? But it gets worse, as things do. This is, Butcher was like saying, he was there that night. Williston Palmer was on the trip with Devers. He was also involved in some of these discussions. Eugene Harrison said maybe this caused something to go wrong. So this is the origin of that famous dysfunctional relationship that costs lives. And they're both at fault. And then he goes to see Patton. And Patton was his subordinate, and Patton was his classmate. And they were close friends, as I said last night, until Jake gets promoted to general first. And then makes 2 stars ahead of Patton, and 3 stars ahead of Patton, and 4 stars ahead of Patton. Weren't close after that. Don't know why. So they bumped him up to the bombers, and I thought Cotton Crane did a superb job of putting that in context of what's going on. And someone was questioning why Jake was so emphatic. Ike asked for 6 bomber groups to be moved to the Mediterranean for a period of some months. He does this in July as Sicily is not seeming to be so easy as the German defenses of Sicily are going on. And he sends that request to Devers, and Devers says, "No, I can't do that. I am supposed to pay attention to the higher mission." That infuriates Ike. The wording is paraphrased, but it's very close to that. So how dare Jake Devers tell me what the overarching mission is, for God's sakes? And then he appeals that decision, a Devers decision, to the Combined Chiefs of Staff, which is the British-American Combined Staffs. They support Devers. He appeals it to Marshall. Marshall supports Devers. Put yourself in that. And the temper of Ike is just incredible. He went ballistic. The point is that there's a letter from Marshall to Devers saying, your #1 job is to build the 8th Air Force up for the combined bomber offensive. Your #1 job. And not to deviate. It has been stripped for way too long of resources and needs to be built up. All Devers was doing was what he was ordered to do. Now later, they send bombers down there when Salerno happens, and it's a close run thing. They do loan bomber groups, but it's a different situation. And by then, the damage has been done to the relationship. That's the Memphis Belle, by the way. First one to get 25 missions, and Aker and Devers are farewelling the crew before they take off to fly home. So the 8th Air Force is critical, and it really drives another nail into the coffin. So by this point, you've got, I think, Ike's concern over who might take his position. He doesn't like the brashness and the optimism of Jake Devers. He misreads that. He's not that kind of guy. Jake lets stuff roll off him. Jake doesn't know what he's done. He thinks Ike and Bradley are his friends. And it's just really incredible. As we know, the bomber offensive was difficult as heck. They needed every bomber they could. And as you pointed out, Con, Jake and Aker really did all they could to deal with a very bad strategy. And when Ike takes over in Europe, become the Supreme Allied Commander for Overlord, the first thing he does is say, send Jake to the Mediterranean. He doesn't ask Marshall. Jake thought he was going to get an army group, and he is shocked as hell, as I said, when he walks down the street and notices that the newspapers are reporting his demise, so to speak. And Aker, same thing, and Con did a good job of covering that, so I won't re-drill that. But then when Jake gets to the Mediterranean, Ike is stripping every competent guy he can out of the Mediterranean, to include Lucian Truscott, who commanded 6th Corps under Jake. 19th Corps was 15th Corps was Haslam. And so Jake gets the command, but when Marshall gives him the command, Jake had asked for it. And as I said last night, so some of this is a repeat, Jake asked for the command from Marshall. Marshall asked Ike. Ike said, well, I really have nothing against him, which is one of the big misstatements of the war. But Jake gets the opportunity because there comes a point where there aren't enough qualified leaders to handle these high and incredibly complex positions. And I can't think of anyone else that could have done it as well as Jake, or better than Jake. Only a few like McNerney, who I think maybe could have done it too. But so he gets that command. He deals with the problems. And so what I'm saying is that this personal relationship cost us opportunities. It shows weakness on both parts, character weaknesses on both parts. You can be too optimistic. It comes from very different backgrounds by two very fine leaders, and it sadly coincides in a couple of crises that could have been resolved differently. No question about it. They could have jumped the Rhine, in my opinion. Devers said so after the war. Gar-Davidson, or at the time, I'm sorry. Gar-Davidson says it. Haslop says it. Ted Brooks says it. All the people on the ground felt they could get across. Whether or not they could have stayed there is a different issue. We now have here in your archive the 6th Army Group history, which I copied from the archives and brought here. 6th Army Group assessment is logistically we could not support more than a division over the Rhine. That we're too short of ammunition, too few logistics. Now that's the loggies talking, and we never listened to them enough. And once you get across a river barrier, lots of bad things can happen. On the other hand, it would have caused the Germans to reposition forces under the American and British Air Forces. So it is a missed opportunity, but in any regard, it came from this poor relationship beforehand. Let's see if there's anything else. The other thing, if you ever do research here and you want to get a better feel for some of these personalities, we have now all of Devers' personnel file. I brought that in the other day, and no one had that until I got them to give it to me through some friends like Hal Nelson, a former chief of military history. And, so it's in your archive, and it has all of his efficiency reports from 1909 to 1949. And what you get is an energetic, optimistic, athletic, outgoing, can-do officer. And that is an incredible resume, in my opinion. And at the very end, Omar Bradley writes his last efficiency report in 1949 and has high praise for Jacob Devers. Ike writes one in 47 and says, I have great confidence in him in anything that requires hands-on doing things with soldiers. I don't have much use at all for him in anything that takes long, thoughtful planning. And he got it dead on the head. Because Devers didn't do the long, thoughtful planning. He trusted his subordinates. In a modern military parlance, we have what's called mission command, and that requires mutual respect both ways. So I hope we kind of built on what these gentlemen have had to say and got some different views. That's about all the palaver I've got, sir.
Okay, well, we're still very much on schedule, so the first little round of questions is directed at Scott in his presentation, and then we'll still have time for more general questions, but they can come anytime now, because he's got the mic, and most of the general questions will be for him anyway. So, who wants to start? Please, yes, sir, right there.
How many four-star generals were there around 1943?
In 43, there were 2 initially.
Yeah.
It was Marshall and MacArthur. And then Ike will be promoted to 4-star general. And I'm not sure.
And Hap Arnold.
And Hap Arnold, the head of the Air Forces. So that.
And then it's 44 when you get to
And 44, you get a plethora of them. And when the promotion time comes, Jake will be promoted ahead of all of them in Europe, even though Ike wanted it the other way around.
Yes, sir.
Why did it take so long to get the 201 file? Why do you think that was buried?
Well, you know, anytime you want to get your grandfather's or grandmother's 201 file, you write to the St. Louis archive, and they said there was a fire. That's their first line of defense. It's the truth. I'm not making this up. And there was a fire, and then you write again and say, well, I know there's a record there, and I'll send you 4 pages. It'll be a summary of service, summary of awards, a cover sheet, and your Freedom of Information request.
And if I may.
Yeah.
Had Tom Grease told General Devers when he first started the project, sir, would you ask for your 201 file? It would have come in the return mail as soon as the general himself asked for it. So it's one of those oversights that you make when you start on a biography of a living subject, assuming that you're going to finish it sometime while the subject is still living. We still deal with that in trying to help people doing long-range oral histories of senior officers today. They assume that the principal will live until they get their act together.
There's a 65-year rule on generals, and Devers had no living direct descendants. His nephew was in this audience. The grandson of Georgie Devers' sister is sitting right in front of you, Jane. So I got that relationship right. But there's no living direct descendant. He's got a stepdaughter who lives in Florida who's a wonderful lady, much younger than Jake. But once we got it, it's incredible. The amount of stuff in it. All of his medical records, and that's fascinating. He's healthy until he's 90 years old. He remarries when he's 87, I believe, isn't it? To a wonderful lady. She lived until 2007. So. A good life, a good person. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Not much was brought up about the tank, but Devers didn't necessarily invent the tank or anything like that. But he seems to be aware of America's shortcomings because they have not the faintest idea how to put a tank together. That was.
Well, he was put in the armored force because the cavalrymen and infantrymen were arguing. I mentioned that last night, a parochial debate on what's the best tank, you know, a fast tank with a machine gun or a slow ponderous tank, and they were both wrong. And he took over and didn't have any of this parochial stuff with the cavalry and infantry, and he pushed them toward a heavier medium tank, 30 tons, Sherman, 75 millimeter turret-mounted gun. And then he put the test mechanism together to test it. But they were also trying to develop a heavy tank. They eventually got 24 of them built. There's 1 or 2 in existence. One of them out in Wheaton, Illinois, the T-26 or whatever they called it. Not T, well, anyway, I think it was T-26.
I don't think they could find a manufacturer that would attempt to do it. Didn't they go to American Locomotive?
Yeah, Alco did a lot of our tanks, but Devers had a really good relationship with Detroit. Very good relationship. He took the time to go talk to them.
He established the fact that the Ordnance Corps was going to be responsible and that it wasn't going to be built in arsenals, which was a big breakthrough. All the airplanes are being built by corporate manufacturers, but the Ordnance Department had a bias toward tooling up arsenals to build things. That's the way we've always done it. Think of Springfield, think of Waterville. And Devers, when he became Armored Command Commander, said we got to have liaison in Detroit And if you go to Detroit today, the Army still has Tank Automotive Command in Detroit. That's one of the lasting innovations that come from Devers being able to really focus. So he's out with all Alice Chalmers and Chrysler and everybody else, getting all the components going, and then the Ordnance Corps will supervise. I'm sorry.
I've always wondered about the tanks themselves. What intelligence was available in regard to the superior German tanks, let's say compared to the Sherman. The Sherman has always been criticized as under-armored with a gun that was too small, that couldn't penetrate German armor. And they put our forces at a distinct disadvantage. And then there's that story about the gas tank and all of that. I wonder what your take is on that, and how in those days, what did they know about the German capabilities, and why wasn't there a better response?
We drive Fords and the Germans drive Mercedes. And Fords get the job done. And the Sherman, when it was deployed, was an incredibly good tank. It was better than any German tank it faced until the Tiger came along.
Con wants to weigh in too.
Yes, sir, Conrad.
Just, I had at the World War II Museum, they did a talk about that, about how long it took to make a German tank. And it's something like 30,000 hours of work, because these are almost handmade, these tanks. By the time you make one Tiger, you've already made hundreds of Shermans, if not thousands. So they were hard to maintain. Yeah, they were great one-on-one on the battlefield, but they were just really expensive and hard to make.
The other thing is that the Germans have to get a tank from the Ruhr to the east or west front. We have to get a tank from Detroit or somewhere out around Detroit all the way to the western front or to North Africa. And so we do have a bias toward the medium tank. And then, of course, it's the ordnance guys who can't figure out how to put a better gun without changing the turret. And it's still an issue. Please, go ahead.
I worked with a gentleman from Germany, and collaborating with this, backing up what this gentleman said, the German tanks were so powerful, but they were made like Mercedes. They were handmade, literally. And he said that part of the problem was when they did break down, we could just take any part off the shelf for the Shermans and put it in. They couldn't. That so many of the specific things in those tanks were literally hand-filed to fit that tank. And so you had to go back and make the cog for that tank exactly the way the original one was. So it's
thank goodness for Eli Whitney. All rifle works, yes sir.
A little bit of information. The German Tiger, now the Panther they made more of, but the Tiger, which weighed 55 tons and had the 88, very, very effective. They finally ended up with a Maybach 12-cylinder, 700 horsepower engine. They made 1,347 of them. We made Sherman, we made 49,800 of them. Now, they made more of the Panther, which had the same Maybach engine, it didn't have the 88 in it.
Right.
It was also a good tank. But the Germans, the 55-ton Tiger was great in level ground, even with the 700 horsepower engine that couldn't climb. When it got in the mud, it stayed in the mud. I mean, that was it. I mean, it was ferocious, and they had marboard steel around it and everything else like that. But it was a useless tank.
And I don't know what they are teaching now down at the World War II Museum, but probably the bigger error in American force structure was the tank destroyer.
Yeah, the doctrine.
The doctrine for the tank destroyer. And unfortunately, Devers didn't really have an opportunity to get his arms around that in the Armor Command in the short time he was there.
If you read the book, he and McNair argued about it for 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Serious arguments. McNair ruled against him and every other expert about the anti-tank doctrine and the quality of the anti-tank and the whole concept. And Devers tried to get command of the anti-tank force, and Marshall said no.
And so his old battery commander from 1910 said, "No, Jakey, you don't get it."
And he said, "Yes, sir," and he did his job to the best.
Isn't it true both earlier in the careers, Jake and Ike were both tank commanders. And I heard about Ike firing his tanks.
Ike was at Fort Meade, Camp Meade, after World War I, at the same time that Patton was there. And Ike was very interested as a young infantry officer in the application of tanks to modern warfare, until the chief of infantry branch said, enough of that, son. You're not going anywhere if you keep talking that way. And Patton, of course, was a tank veteran of World War I combat at Samael and Meuse-Argonne. And so as a result, he had confidence in his views of tanks. They may have been wrong, but he had great confidence. So Devers and Patton probably never really had a conversation about tanks before World War II, because Devers was doing other things. And Eisenhower and Patton didn't have many conversations after about 1922 about tanks either. As late as when Patton is a student wasn't at Carl Alvarez, as late as he's a student at the War College in the mid-30s, Patton is still arguing that the cavalry branch needs to have both tanks and horses, not a cavalry. And so he's a very sophisticated student of the military art for the United States, because he's been in two wars. He was on the Mexican punitive expedition as well as World War I. And in the poor infrastructure of Mexico, don't tell me we're going to use tanks, you see. So Patton really was a theoretician of the tanks. And he's
out west, where was it artillery or tanks that Devers?
When Devers was first commissioned, he is out in Wyoming with artillery. Actually, he's in Vancouver Barracks first, and then he's in Wyoming.
Artillery.
Artillery.
Oh, okay.
He's an artilleryman. And he's involved in the tank issue, but it is the motorization, mechanization of artillery. Mm-hmm. And he has that down cold, and he's a progressive. You know, we've talked about whether he's a maverick. He's probably not so much a maverick as a progressive, trying to move the Army forward in areas where the Army isn't sure that it can be afforded or that it's the right move. And he's doing it at a time when either of those arguments is very powerful. We can't afford it because it's the 1920s and the 30s, or the right move. You modernize in peacetime with 1920s technology, you buy 1920s technology, and you raise your hand in 1935 saying, oh, the trucks are a lot better now. We don't like these trucks anymore. Tough, Congress says. And that's still a dilemma for military planners. So that's what we're looking at here, I think.
I thought that might be another reason that Ike and Devers didn't get along.
Well,
because they...
In a sense. But Ike is the staff officer who is in Washington, worrying through industrial mobilization, and then being the right-hand man to decision makers. Whereas Jake is out there in various command and high-level staff positions in the field, where what comes from Washington is what you have to deal with. So in some ways, Ike has been trained up year after year after year as a strategist. How do we take available resources and modify them to best meet the national security needs? While Jake has been operational, how do I take what the national capital authorities give me and do the best I can with it? And that's one of the reasons I support Scott in saying that Jake couldn't have done what Ike did, and Ike wouldn't have been very good at what Jake did. Right from the beginning, right from commanding the 9th Infantry Division. It's amazing. And Marshall gets a lot of credit for this, by the way. He didn't know Devers. He didn't really know Eisenhower either. But he knew how to pick talent. It's amazing. Yes, sir. All the way to the back.
I was curious about the tank situation. The British developed, took they call it a cricket, and they actually put a cannon into a barrel, a lumber barrel, and the Firefly was built.
Yeah.
Firefly.
Firefly,
I think they called it, yeah.
And it was such a simple solution. And I was wondering, since General Devers did not care for the British, was he instrumental in not allowing that to be done in America?
No. That's the kind of thing that gets done in the production base. And he didn't stay in the production base, because as soon as he goes to England, he's not worrying about that stuff anymore. And I don't know if we can address it. I don't think there's anything in our archive here that where Jake is forwarding or disagreeing with anything coming out of the British production base.
Almost no American generals like the British.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
Yeah.
You go look and you scratch just a teeny bit. And
But it's a good question,
So
because
it is.
you see, when Devers goes to North Africa, late 42, the British are receiving their first deliveries of Sherman tanks. One of the reasons there's no Sherman tanks in our training base is the British are in trouble in North Africa, and we're trying to deploy forces. And so the British have had experience with the Grant, which they hated as much as the Americans did, as a target, and they are starting to have experience with the Sherman. And he picked up on a lot of this stuff. But at that stage, they're mostly encountering Mark IVs, and they love the Sherman, because as Scott says, at that stage in the war, it matched the battlefield requirement. But what's happening starting in late 41 is the Germans are fighting on the Eastern Front, and they're fighting superior Russian tanks. And so that's what's feeding back into their production base, not us. They're trying to optimize against the T-34. Now, the British do then figure out how to put a 76 millimeter long cannon tube into a Sherman. And the Canadians and the British have them by 1944. Meanwhile, we're struggling in Detroit and in other places. We're trying to basically build a heavy tank. And we do get a long tube 75 into the Sherman as a modification by the end of the war. And that does increase the muzzle velocity, and we do get a discarding sabot round, which further increases muzzle velocity, which is what the British have also innovated. But the problem of getting good ideas back into the production base was not one that either Ike or Devers were worrying about very much. Please.
Can you speak a little bit more on Devers' role after the E-Day? Was he planning to do a specific campaign?
You might have to repeat that.
Yeah, what did Devers do after the war, Daddy? And he was initially going to be commanding the organization in Europe to retrain all the units going to Japan. And then it became very clear that we didn't need that. So they stood down the 6th Army Group and the 12th Army Group and everybody, in fact, practically the 3rd and the 7th Armies. And he went back to the United States, and Marshall appointed him Army Ground Forces Commander, which he then is effectively that until he retires in 49. When he came home, he was basically suffering from PTSD. And they had a requirement that he go down to Florida for 2 weeks with his wife to a military convalescence center for all ranks, as many as they could afford to put in these things, and take 2 weeks to cool down. And his wife said when he writes to her sister, or his sister, saying when he first came back, he just ordered her to do this and do that, and then was surprised when people looked at him with this hurt look. Yeah, well, get it, JB, you're home. You're back with Mom. So anyway, it was, but he did a lot of things. He helped pioneer helicopters in the U.S. Army, which was quite an accomplishment. He helped reorganize the Army as resources went straight down. That whole period, if you're going to take an Army after a war, those 4 years are well documented. And he was instrumental to do all he could to keep an effective, deployable Army, and he didn't succeed. He did a good shot, but he didn't succeed.
That's after, but I think one of his greatest accomplishments was before the war, and what he did in building Fort Bragg,
Yeah.
Fort Scott. To me, when I read that, it was absolutely amazing in 6 months what he did.
It's neat, but you go back to World War II, what's the biggest American weapon on the battlefield? What kills more Germans than anything?
Artillery.
Field artillery. And Devers worked twice at the artillery school, once during World War I, and then again in the late 20s, and he was one of 2 or 3 people that really put together the innovations making possible the ability of an American artillery observer to mask the fires dozens, if you needed to, artillery battalions. Like the 1st Infantry call for fire 10,000 rounds in 10 minutes. No army on the earth could do that. And it's our logistics, but more important, is this thing done? So that's another huge accomplishment, his role in modernizing artillery. And again, trial and error and find the right guys to do the work, because he wasn't a genius at all that stuff.
How did the average ground troop view debtors?
You know, like there was nothing derogatory, there's not the hate or the love-hate you get with Patton. So it's something that there's just not, there's no gun, you know, there's no bullet fired, no smoking gun. So I can't really answer that with any kind of certainty. It's a good question.
What was the question?
I'm sorry, how did the soldiers view General Devers, the soldiers in 6th Army Group, and so forth?
And the French, they loved him, didn't they?
Well, the French liked him, but he also reined the French in too. So yeah, he had some days with the French that were very difficult, if we leave it at that. Yeah, he let the laughter come in and dribble all over his boots, and then he would jack him up and write him a letter and tell him to do more, and then hug him, which is what you have to do with the lot. But the French do a tremendous job. They absorb enormous casualties.
Yes, please. Yes, sir.
I was raised up in Butler, Pennsylvania, and my father worked at American Banner
Yeah.
in 1939, 1940, and he was making 41. He came home one day and he says, let us see the new vehicle the American Banner put together. And American Banner came out with what we now call the Jeep.
Right.
They designed the thing that the contract was taken away from them because they couldn't make the quantity. Then he went to work up in Boyle City in Boyle Supply. And he would talk about his work. He said, we have a terrific turning out shells, a terrific shell, 37 millimeter anti-tank shell. These are that kind of that.
Yeah.
And then he worked on internal combustion engine for the torpedo. And I didn't recall till later that we had the worst torpedoes at the early part. They were not working as a precision, they finally got it fixed up.
Right.
It was not the fault of the propulsion, but it was how they put together.
It was
So
fusing.
it's interesting, I'm thinking back, how we got into the time, but I don't remember.
Well, and, you know, that was the sort of thing that the armored force, especially your first two items, the 37 millimeter anti-tank and the Peep, or the Jeep as it became, they're trying to figure out how that gets integrated into the weapon systems that will be used. And we kept building 37 millimeters thinking they were great for a long, long time when they weren't good for much. And, but that's another story. Yes, sir.
Given the small size of the pre-war army, a lot of them talk about the relationship between Devers and Eisenhower from 42 on. Did they ever meet or have any kind of professional relationship before the war?
Did they have a relationship before the war? No. I graduated in 1915. Omar Bradley was on the baseball team that Devers was the manager for. It was an undefeated baseball team. But if I knew anything about Devers, he just knew about him as a mathematics P, which is one of the most hated vermin on earth. For people like me, history, they're wonderful. And so there's no evidence at all that they interconnected. And then Ike was gone so much.
Yes, sir, please.
I'd like to ask a question about Eisenhower at West Point when Devers was coach. I read a report that Eisenhower once stated that the biggest disappointment in his life was that he was not able to make the West Point baseball team. Would that possibly have...
I don't think that I have no record of that. And remember, Ike had already screwed up his knee in football. And I tell you, if you played softball or baseball, you know that you need your knees. And so it's very likely that he couldn't make the team. And Devers was not the coach, he was the manager. And the coach would have been the guy that would have picked it. And you know, I don't think that there's any there. But whether or not Devers had any role in it, I don't know. I kind of try to go on evidence, although I did admit that one time that I'm reading Ike's mind, so to be fair, I make stuff up.
Anything else? Yes, sir. Way in the back first.
Yeah, Devers retired in '49. Did he play a role in gaining our origin and the first few years?
I'm sorry, the last part of the question. Oh, NATO, no. No, he didn't play any role other than saying we don't have forces to deploy, which he told his chief of staff, who was Dwight David Eisenhower, 48, 49, and it was true. He then, after that, was the military advisor to the Kashmir Commission, Pakistan, India. And then he went on to work for Fairchild Aircraft Company and tried to sell the AR-15 to the Army, which we didn't buy, and then Colt bought the patent. Fairchild went bankrupt, and Colt continued to make millions of AR-15s. And then in about 1960, he becomes head of the Battlefield Monument Commission and spent quite a bit of time representing the President of the United States, Dwight David Eisenhower, in any kind of celebration in Europe so that I didn't have to go.
There was another hand here. Yes, sir.
I appreciate what you gentlemen do because I love history. And for a long time, prior to this, but for a long time, I looked at certain figures kind of, godlike. And Eisenhower was one of them.
And he still should be.
Well, I do have just a bit of problems with that, General, because his decision to just abandon Strasbourg, it seemed to me to be so cold-blooded, knowing damn well that the Gestapo was going to go back in there and just slaughter those people. That's a lot of people to just turn over. Honor is a big thing, and all of us who have served in the military know that. It's huge. And to just turn your back on those people, that's one thing that diminishes him in my eyes. The other thing is, I have a question for you, Colonel, is was he so surrounded with sycophants that he simply could not handle the possibility that Devers could cross the Rhine first and get that honor? And so because of it, we lost a lot of men.
I'll
At the
defer
Battle of
to
the Bulge, we lost a lot of good men for no other reason than a political general. And that, the biggest sin you can commit, as far as I'm concerned, is to lose your men for no good reason. Men die, that's the way it is.
Let's take turns then. I'll let the authors start.
Yeah, that was huge.
Got the microphone.
That was a huge moral problem, and
I don't mean to start a fight.
After it was all over with on the 6th of January, the question was Ike so surrounded by sycophants in his close group that he didn't really listen to other views? The answer is yes, in my opinion. That's fairly straightforward. And he was isolated, and he was also preoccupied with Montgomery and Bradley and the Bulge when all was happening. Why he didn't listen to Devers, I've explained. I think it depends, and that's another flaw. And at the end of the day, he wrote a letter to Marshall on the 6th of January saying, I never intended to give up Strasbourg anyway. And it's an absolute bald-ass lie.
Sounds like the cigarette companies like
I would reflect on that by saying I always had the impression that Eisenhower was afraid to make a decision. He had so many opinions coming directed at him. He had to deal with the British. He had to deal with Patton. He had to deal with Bradley. He had to deal with all these various sources and personalities. I tried to figure out, for example, the argument about the broad front single thrust strategy. You could study that until you're blue in the face and you can't really figure out what it was. Some people say, well, Eisenhower believed in a broad front. It was Montgomery that wanted the single thrust, but it changes all the time. So I think that Eisenhower kind of waffled back and forth, trying to please Montgomery at one time, trying to please Patton at another, and he just never tried. He tried to not make that decision, and ultimately, I do believe that once the war was going along, the ultimate victory was there. It was just a matter of reaching it and how many men you wanted to expend. So keep going the way you are fighting the war, regardless of whether it's the proper way or not. But I just think he had a difficult time making a decision.
And Dr. Crane wishes to weigh in.
I think Ike made the right decision not to go across the Rhine to Strasbourg. The terrain, one division in that part of the front isn't going to make much difference. The Germans could have bottled it up with a very small force and still done the bulge, in my view. I'm just throwing out as a contrary view. There's not universal agreement on this sort of stuff. I do think that Ike was incorrect about the abandoning of Strasbourg. I think that was a mistake that he luckily never had to bear. But I really think if you look, I haven't looked at it in the detail they have, but knowing what I know about the terrain, and with Scott's admission that they're only going to probably sustain a division across there. And if Gar Davidson says that, who's another one of these real underestimated people from the war, who does some great things at West Point, does some great things in Korea, if he said they can only sustain a division, I don't see one division making a whole lot of difference in that part of the front.
But sir, he could have crossed back over, number one. Number two, had he gone at Rostov, around that area, what would have happened is that giant buildup that for some reason Ike couldn't see. It boggles my mind that he couldn't see that buildup up in the Ardennes. Even if Devers would have had one division over there for 4 days, you know what would have happened with the Germans, right?
Yeah.
They'd have said, oh my God, they're coming down there. No, you take 3 of those Panzer divisions and a couple of infantry divisions.
Just one thing, the great thing about what if history is you can never be proven wrong.
That's right.
Sir, that's why you have a job and you're here to help educate us.
Well, then let's educate a bit. The German experience with unexpected penetrations is going to be exported from the Eastern Front. Whereas Kahn says they do an assessment of the attacking force, they do an assessment of the terrain, and with minimum forces, they block the incursion. And then they decide later what they're going to do next. And so whether, you know, in the whole school of what-ifs history, anybody can write the books. So I think you just have to leave it at that the state of art in Germany was far advanced over our own state of art of dealing with a major incursion, because they've been doing it again and again and again since the winter of 41-42 on the Eastern Front. With varying degrees of success, I might add, but with a great growth of experience and doctrine in the German army on how to deal with the unexpected penetration, which we hadn't really been thinking about. We were an offensive army without much thought of the operational level dealing with a penetration. So they're two different armies. Yeah, please follow up.
This is an argument that go on forever, but one thing I'd like to point out is that at this particular time, in the war, there were 2 airborne divisions sitting in Great Britain. They were used during the Battle of the Bulge. So you had, and these airborne divisions were just screaming to get into the action. They couldn't get into the action because by the time they pick an objective in France, and by the time they were ready to drop on that objective, the advance had already taken that objective. In the Schaeff directives, one of the things it states is that they would use airborne troops to seize a bridgehead over the Rhine. So here you have 2 divisions sitting, waiting for some kind of action. Eisenhower probably wouldn't have used them in Strasbourg because he didn't like Devers. But you also had a number of divisions sitting in Brittany containing the Germans there. So at any given time, you probably could have, had they desired to do so, mustered anywhere from 20 to 100,000 troops to, I don't think they would have ever taken 100,000 troops, but you could have dropped an airborne division across the river to support the Strasbourg attack, and that was a plan, that was actually a plan that they never put in motion. So it's not as though there weren't reserves available, they just were never employed.
Please, you first. Checker Church.
Just quick, whose decision was it to go forth with Market Garden? That's Bridget Vermont, correct?
Right.
Whose decision was it to do that instead of do
No,
Dever?
not the bridge too far. the Remagen Bridge is on the Rhine. Market Garden is the thrust up into the Netherlands to try to get across the lower Rhine. Eisenhower approves it, and Marshall had, even before D-Day, been advocating the deep use of airborne troops. Again, it's one of these things we've spent a lot of money on, and we haven't really gotten a lot of good out of it yet. So let's see if we can figure out how it'll work. It's sort of like the 8th Air Force.
It is Montgomery's idea, though, which shocks everybody.
Yeah, it's Montgomery's idea, which shocks everybody. There was a question right next to you.
It is interesting that Devers told Forrest Poe in one of his interviews in about 1956 that he thought Eisenhower made the right decision in not letting him cross the line.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to this logistics piece. Professionals worry about logistics. 20,000 more guys across the Rhine means you go on half rations twice as fast, and you run out of ammunition twice as fast if you can't push the stuff that those additional 20,000 troops need. If you've got one division over, you've probably got about 20,000 over. So that's why I think as he puzzles over it, as he listens to guys like Davidson, who rise up to 3-star rank himself, and you think, yeah, you know, I really did have a good team, and they did tell me what the constraints were. Now, the other thing to think about, we don't talk much about the French, but what's going on in the French army is de Gaulle is saying, hey, I need a lot of those guys. We got to clear out that Bordeaux area. There's a whole bunch of Germans over there. And you guys just bypassed them, and you're talking about how great it is that you're all the way up on the eastern borders of France. We got thousands of people that have still got Germans underfoot. Give me a couple of those divisions. And oh, by the way, at the same time, the French are saying, you know, these Tunisians and Moroccans are really not so good now the winter's coming on. We need to keep the American equipment and the American formations that we call the French army, but we need to reman it. And so Devers is under tremendous pressure to hold the First French Army together and to keep it at the front in a way that will be helpful to him. So he's got pressures that I think in retrospect he recognized, and he did at the time.
Yeah, I mean for political purposes for the French, for their priorities. Keep them up.
You've got to push them through the Belfort Gap and keep them forward, that's right. Well, have we exhausted everybody, if not every subject?
The Q&A reminds me that success has many fathers and failure is a bastard child.
Yes, sir. One last question.
Many years ago, I read Eisenhower's Crusade in Europe.
Yes.
This was 50, 60 years ago. I think he said when the war started, he was a lieutenant colonel in Louisiana. He was called to Washington as a permanent lieutenant colonel, and I forget the time period, but no time at all he was a general.
That's right.
Who was his mentor? Who picked him?
Marshall picked him. Marshall picked him. And his mentor really was MacArthur, much as it was a love-hate relationship. The senior general with whom Eisenhower served the most, learned the most from, was Douglas MacArthur. No two ways about it. And I think he probably swore, I'm not going to be like that man. MacArthur was the chief of staff when Eisenhower was a young staff officer. And when MacArthur left to go to build the Philippine Army, he took Ike with him as a serving officer. And so they had years together, first in the War Department and then in the Philippines.
So MacArthur and Marshall.
And then when he came back, when Marshall brought him to Washington after he'd proven himself as a planner at the operational level, Marshall basically set a task for him to outline the best strategy with respect to the far Pacific. Ike went down to his office, his new office, wrote out some notes, came back that afternoon with what became the short-term strategic position of the War Department with respect to the Philippines, and then became eventually the head of war plans. So he was brought forward then as a strategic thinker, a staff officer, a contributor to the great national security policy, not as a guy who really worked the operational piece.
What was the time period from lieutenant colonel to general? I don't remember.
Well, it's basically a little longer than this meeting. But it happened to all of them years years and years and years in whatever rank you were stuck in when, or reverted to when World War I was over. Major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, and in some cases they leap over the rank of colonel to general because Congress supervises the promotion lists from within the field grades, but the president can nominate people for general officer from whatever rank. And so Marshall understands that. He's been the chief of staff since '39. He works with the Secretary of War, he works with the president to get some people promoted very, very quickly.
Air Corps promotions are actually faster.
Yeah, the Air Corps promotions are even faster. Yes,
It's
sir.
ironic with all the criticism of MacArthur that Devers cited Marshall and MacArthur as his two people he admired the most.
MacArthur was admirable. He was admirable. And Devers was working hard problems at West Point while MacArthur was chief of staff. And I believe that, you know, MacArthur had been the superintendent at West Point back after World War I while Devers was there. And I don't know that we can document any of this at all, but I would guess that things were a little easier than they might have been at West Point because MacArthur was supporting, with the little bit of money they could raise, initiatives that he was trying to push through at West Point. And Devers did a lot for West Point in his years there, as you'll find out if you read the book. Okay, thanks a lot.